morning mist still clung to the towering pines when a sharp cry shattered the silence of the forest. A young moose calf, barely steady on its legs, stumbled toward a clearing, its wide eyes filled with panic. From the shadows, dark figures emerged. A small group of hungry bears, their heavy steps crunching the frost-covered ground as they closed in. The calf's frantic bleats echoed through the trees, a desperate call for help that seemed to vanish into the endless wilderness. The bears circled, their growls low and menacing, teeth glinting as they prepared to strike. But just as the forest seemed to seal the calf's fate, the undergrowth behind them began to stir. Branches snapped, birds scattered into the sky, and a sound unlike any the hunters had ever heard rolled through the trees. Deep, resonant, and powerful. Something enormous was waking. The bears lunged closer, their massive bodies rippling with power as they herded the calf against a cluster of fallen logs. The young moose's thin legs trembled, its cries breaking into ragged gasps. Each second dragged heavier than the last, the forest holding its breath as predator and prey stood on the edge of violence. Then from the dense line of spruces, a deep rumble shook the ground. The bears froze, ears twitching, their dark eyes snapping toward the sound. Another crack thundered as branches gave way, splintering under something far larger than themselves. The air grew heavy, as though the forest itself recoiled from what was approaching. The calf stood still, sides heaving, its tiny chest rising and falling rapidly. For a moment, the predators and their prey were united in the same sensation: fear of the unknown. From the wall of trees, shadows began to move. First, a massive antler pushed through the foliage, glinting in the pale morning light. Then another, and another. The bears let out uneasy growls, backing a step as colossal shapes emerged from the forest depths. Towering bull moose, their racks like crowns of sharpened spears, eyes burning with primal fury. The forest had answered the calf's cry, and it did not come gently. The ground seemed to tremble beneath the hooves of the massive bulls as they stormed into the clearing. Their breath steamed in the cold air, nostrils flaring, antlers lowering in a display of raw power. The calf staggered backward, collapsing to its knees, but the giants had already taken position, forming a wall of muscle and bone between it and the circling predators. The bears hesitated, their growls now tinged with uncertainty. They had faced moose before, but never like this. These were not wandering animals. They were guardians answering a call. With a sudden bellow, the lead bull charged. The earth shook under its weight as it thundered forward, antlers lowered like a living spear. One of the bears reared onto its hind legs, roaring defiantly, but it was too slow. The clash was brutal, antlers slamming into flesh with a sickening crack, sending the bear tumbling across the frost with a howl of pain. The others snarled, circling wider, testing the line of towering bulls. But each moose moved in unison, their massive bodies shifting with surprising agility, antlers flashing like weapons forged by the forest itself. The young calf bleated weakly from the ground, its wide eyes reflecting both terror and awe. The hunters had become the hunted, and the forest was not finished yet. The clearing erupted in chaos. The injured bear staggered to its feet, blood matting the fur along its shoulder, but it dared not lunge again. Its companions circled, their growls echoing through the trees. Yet their movements had lost the certainty of hunters. They were no longer predators. They were intruders. The lead bull stamped the frozen ground, his massive rack catching the pale light as if crowned in fire. Each snort of his breath sent clouds of mist billowing like smoke, a living warning to the creatures before him. Another bull surged forward, antlers sweeping wide. One bear leapt aside at the last second, claws tearing through the soil, but the sheer force of the moose's charge ripped bark from a tree as the antlers gouged deep into its trunk. The sound, a splintering crack, made the entire forest shiver. The bears growled, snapping their jaws, but they did not advance. They paced in frustrated arcs, eyes darting between the calf and the towering guardians. Their hunger clashed with a primal knowledge buried deep in their bones. This fight was not theirs to win. The calf bleated again, voice trembling, but now it was not a cry of despair. The giants stood over it, a fortress of flesh and bone, their antlers forming a wall of spears against the advancing shadows. One more step from the bears could mean death. The forest had shifted, its judgment clear. The wounded bear limped to the side, its growls rasping low, while the other two circled tighter, foam gathering at their jaws. Their eyes burned with desperation, not just hunger, but the refusal to leave empty-pawed. One of them finally broke the stalemate. With a guttural roar, it lunged forward, claws outstretched, aiming to slip past the wall of antlers and reach the calf. But the forest guardians were ready. The bull nearest the calf lowered his massive rack and surged ahead with a force that shook the ground. The two collided, the bear's claws scraping fur and drawing blood. But the antlers speared past its defenses. With a violent heave, the moose tossed the predator sideways, sending it sprawling into the brush with a pained bellow. The last bear froze, panting heavily, its paws sinking into the frost as it weighed its chances. The bulls lined themselves shoulder to shoulder, their antlers glinting like a wall of blades. Each step they took forward drove the bear further back, their heavy hooves striking like drums of war. The young calf, trembling in the shadows of its protectors, managed to stagger onto its legs again. Its thin cry rose, not in despair this time, but in defiance. And with that sound, the balance tipped. The final bear turned, snarling one last time, then slipped back into the tree line. The others limped after it, their roars fading into the distance. But the forest did not relax. The giants remained still, antlers lowered, breath steaming in the cold morning air. The battle was won. Yet something far greater loomed in the silence that followed. The forest clearing lay in eerie silence, broken only by the heavy breaths of the bulls. Their massive sides rose and fell like bellows, nostrils flaring, antlers still poised for war. The calf pressed itself against the nearest giant, trembling but alive, its wide eyes darting nervously between the shadows where the bears had vanished. But the danger wasn't gone yet. From the underbrush came a deep growl, low and guttural. The largest of the bears, scarred, limping, but not defeated, emerged once more. Blood streaked its flank from the earlier clash, but its eyes burned with raw fury. This was no longer about hunger. It was pride, vengeance. The bulls stamped the ground in unison, a thunderous warning that reverberated through the trees. Frost cracked beneath their hooves as they stepped forward, forming a crescent shield around the calf. Their breath steamed like smoke from a furnace, filling the air with tension so thick it felt alive. The wounded bear reared onto its hind legs, bellowing in rage, towering high. But even then, it could not match the sheer mass of antlered giants that faced it. For a suspended heartbeat, predator and guardians stood locked in a primal standoff, the very air trembling between them. Then with a roar, the bear lunged. The lead bull answered in kind, his antlers crashing forward like a battering ram, and the forest erupted once more in chaos. The impact shook the clearing like a thunderclap. Antlers smashed into flesh, the sound of bone against bone echoing through the forest. The great bear staggered but did not fall. Its claws raked across the bull's flank, leaving long, bleeding gashes. The bull bellowed, a deafening roar that rolled through the trees, yet it held its ground, shoving forward with unstoppable force. Two other bulls surged beside their leader, their antlers sweeping low, driving the beast back step by step. The bear's roars turned to snarls, teeth snapping wildly, saliva spraying in the cold air. But for every strike it landed, the guardians answered with the sheer weight of their bodies, hooves pounding the frozen earth like war drums. The calf stumbled, nearly collapsing again, but the wall of moose shifted seamlessly, shielding it from every angle. Their formation was unbreakable, a fortress of muscle, bone, and fury. The bear let out one final roar and lunged recklessly, trying to break through. That was its mistake. The lead bull twisted his head sharply, catching the predator between his massive antlers. With terrifying strength, he heaved upward, lifting the bear clear off the ground. The forest gasped with a single voice as the beast was hurled sideways, crashing into the underbrush with a sickening thud. Branches splintered, snow burst into the air, and then silence. The bears that had retreated earlier did not return. The forest had made its judgment. The calf, weak but alive, leaned into the towering shadows of its guardians. And for the first time since the attack began, it was safe. The great bear lay half-buried in the undergrowth, its massive chest heaving, eyes glazed with fury and pain. It tried to rise, pushing against the earth with trembling paws. But the strength that had once made it a terror of the forest was gone. Blood streaked its fur, steaming in the cold air. The bulls did not relent. With slow, deliberate steps, they advanced as one, their antlers lowered in a silent threat. The ground trembled beneath their hooves, every movement a declaration that no predator would pass this line again. The bear's ears flicked back, its growl faltering. For the first time, hesitation crept into its eyes. It looked from one bull to the next, each towering over it, their steaming breath rising like smoke, their eyes gleaming with primal rage. The message was clear: leave or be destroyed. The wounded beast gave a final snarl, more hollow than defiant, and then turned. Limping heavily, it disappeared into the shadows of the pines, leaving only the echo of its retreat. A stillness fell over the clearing. The calf wobbled on its shaky legs, bleating softly, its small frame pressing against the chest of the nearest bull. The guardians stood unmoving, ears twitching, their eyes scanning the trees for any sign of return. But nothing stirred. The forest had fallen silent again, but it was no longer the silence of fear. It was the silence of victory. The line of bulls held their ground long after the last bear had vanished into the tree line. Their massive bodies stood like living statues, antlers gleaming in the pale morning light, breath rising in thick clouds that drifted above the clearing. The calf pressed close, sides heaving, its thin legs trembling with exhaustion. For a moment, its small cry echoed, fragile, uncertain, and one of the bulls turned its massive head, lowering its muzzle until it brushed against the calf's neck in a rare gesture of reassurance. The villagers who had watched from afar could scarcely believe what they had seen. Whispers rippled among them, voices filled with awe and disbelief. They had expected to witness a kill, the inevitable triumph of predators over prey. Instead, they had witnessed something far older and more primal. The forest itself rising in defense of one of its own. The blood of the great bear stained the frost, a reminder of the ferocity that had been unleashed. Yet the air no longer carried the heavy dread of death. It carried something else: respect, reverence. The calf stumbled again, but remained on its feet, shielded by the circle of its guardians. The balance of the forest had shifted, and nothing would ever be the same for those who had witnessed it. The forest seemed to breathe again, but not in calm, in reverence. The bulls remained in formation, their eyes fixed on the tree line, waiting for any sign of movement. The ground was littered with torn branches, trampled frost, and streaks of blood where the great bear had fallen. The calf swayed unsteadily, sides quivering, but it no longer cried. Instead, it stood silent between the towering legs of its protectors, its wide eyes reflecting the antlers above like a crown of spears. Minutes passed like hours. The only sounds were the snorts of the bulls and the faint rustle of wind weaving through the trees. Slowly, the tension began to ease. One by one, the giants lifted their heads, antlers catching the pale light as if saluting the sky. Their formation loosened, but the circle around the calf never broke. The villagers remained rooted in place, unable to tear their eyes away. They had witnessed not just survival, but a revelation. The raw, unshakable bond of the herd, greater than the hunger of predators, greater even than death itself. The calf stumbled once more, but this time, the lead bull nudged it gently forward. The message was clear. It was time to move, to return to the safety of the deeper forest. And as the giants turned, their colossal forms fading back into the mist of the pines, the people knew they had seen something few ever would. The guardians had risen, and the forest itself had spoken. The calf staggered beside the lead bull, its legs shaky, but every step steadier than the last. The massive guardians surrounded it as they moved, antlers catching the pale morning sun like spears forged from the forest itself. Their breath came in deep clouds, drifting upward and dissolving into the still air. Behind them, The clearing bore the scars of the battle: torn earth, shattered branches, and the deep tracks of retreating predators. The blood-stained trail where the bear had fallen glistened dark against the frost, a silent reminder that even the fiercest hunters could be broken. The villagers watched in hushed awe as the herd began to vanish between the trees. The sound of hooves thudding against the earth echoed like a drumbeat, fading slowly into the distance. Each beat carried weight, not just of victory, but of warning. The forest would always protect its own. The calf turned once, its large eyes meeting the stunned humans at the edge of the clearing. For a heartbeat, the world stood still, the fragile survivor framed by the towering bodies of its guardians. And then, with a flick of its ears, it followed the herd into the shadowed embrace of the forest. The clearing was empty once more. But for those who had seen it, the memory of what rose from the woods that morning would never fade. As the herd disappeared deeper into the pines, the mist swallowed their colossal forms one by one, until only the faint sound of hooves remained. Each fading thud echoed like a heartbeat through the trees, steady, unyielding, then slowly dissolved into silence. The villagers stood motionless at the edge of the clearing, their torches dimming, smoke curling upward into the cold morning air. None dared to speak, as though words might break the fragile weight of what they had witnessed. Where moments ago chaos had reigned, blood, roars, and the clash of giants, now only the aftermath lingered. Shattered branches lay like broken bones across the frost. The soil was torn and gouged, marked forever by the struggle. And at the center, the young calf's tracks trailed off into the woods, proof of a life spared by something greater than chance. One of the elders finally whispered, almost to himself, "The forest protects its own." The others bowed their heads, not in mourning, but in reverence. For in the rise of those giants from the trees, they had glimpsed not just power, but a law far older than man, the bond of blood, of herd, of survival. The bears would return someday, hunger always did, but none who stood in that clearing would ever forget the day the forest rose against them, and the day a calf lived because the guardians answered. The clearing lay eerily still, a scar upon the forest floor. Frost was churned into mud where hooves had struck, and splintered logs marked the path of antlers swung in fury. Drops of blood stained the ground, already beginning to darken as the cold air froze them in place. The villagers lingered at the edge, still clutching their fading torches. Some exchanged glances, but most stood silent, their eyes fixed on the trees where the herd had vanished. Even the children, who moments earlier had wept in fear, now stared in wide-eyed wonder. For them, the story would never be about the calf alone. It would be about the giants, colossal shadows that rose from the mist to shield it when death was certain. Far in the distance, the faint sound of hooves rumbled once more, then faded for good. The forest swallowed its guardians whole, leaving only the memory of their presence. Slowly, the villagers began to back away from the clearing, each step heavy with the knowledge of what they had witnessed. To interfere again would feel almost sacrilegious. The forest had revealed its power, and all who had seen it would carry that memory and that warning for the rest of their lives. The villagers retreated step by step, yet their eyes never left the forest's edge. Every shadow between the pines seemed alive. Every creak of a branch, a reminder of the titans that had stood guard only moments before. The elder who had whispered earlier now raised his hand, silencing the murmurs of those around him. His voice was low, steady, but it carried weight. "We are guests here. Never forget that." The people nodded, though their gazes still clung to the darkness where the moose had vanished. Some crossed themselves, others pressed hands to their chests. Reverence had replaced fear. The clearing itself bore witness. Gouges in the earth like battle scars, the blood of predator and guardian alike staining the frost. It was no longer just a hunting ground. It had become something sacred, a place marked by the struggle between hunger and protection, between death and survival. The calf's faint tracks leading into the mist stood as the final signature, proof that life had endured where it should have ended. No one dared disturb them. Instead, the villagers turned away, torches flickering weakly in the growing light, their silence heavy with understanding. They knew the story would spread, carried by every tongue in the valley. The day the bears attacked, and the day the giants rose. Long after the villagers had begun their retreat, the clearing still pulsed with the memory of what had taken place. The air smelled of churned soil and blood, mingling with the sharp scent of pine. Every broken branch, every hoofprint etched into the ground, told the tale of a battle few would ever believe unless they had seen it with their own eyes. At the edge of the trees, a final sound drifted back to them. Not the roar of a predator, but the deep, resonant grunt of a bull. It was not anger nor warning. It was a declaration. The message was unmistakable. The forest had defenders greater than any predator that stalked its shadows. The calf's tracks led deeper into the mist, fragile impressions beside the cavernous prints of its guardians. The trail soon vanished into the tangle of roots and undergrowth, swallowed whole by the wilderness. Yet to those who had witnessed it, the image was burned into memory. A young life sheltered by giants, spared by the will of the wild. The villagers paused once more before leaving the clearing behind. None dared speak. None dared disturb the silence left in the wake of the moose, because what had risen that morning was not just a herd, it was the forest itself. The villagers lingered at the edge of the clearing, unwilling to turn their backs completely. The mist thickened, curling like smoke between the black pines, as if the forest itself wished to erase the evidence of what had happened. Yet the ground told its own story. Deep gouges carved by hooves and claws scarred the frozen soil. Crimson stains glistened faintly where the bear had fallen, a brutal reminder that nature's balance demanded blood. And still, alongside those marks, the delicate impressions of the calf remained. Lighter, fragile, but undeniable proof that innocence had survived where destruction had ruled. A hush settled over the people. No one dared step into the battlefield, as though it now belonged to something greater than themselves. Some bowed their heads, others simply stood in silence, unable to shake the vision of the towering moose rising from the trees, antlers gleaming like weapons of the gods. One by one, the villagers turned back toward their homes, torches flickering weakly in the pale light of dawn. But they carried with them more than fear or awe. They carried a story, one that would outlive them, whispered by firelight for generations. The day the calf was saved, the day the bears were broken, and the day the giants rose from the forest. The clearing grew colder as the first light of dawn stretched across the treetops. The mist lifted in thin ribbons, curling through the wounds left in the soil. Where the earth had been torn by antlers and claws, shadows lingered, as though the battle itself refused to fade. The villagers, now farther down the trail, still paused to glance back. None spoke, but in their silence was agreement. They had not merely witnessed animals fighting for survival, they had witnessed something older, something sacred. The calf's small prints beside the titanic strides of its guardians remained etched into the frost. With each step deeper into the woods, the trail became harder to follow until at last it vanished, swallowed whole by the wild. But the memory would not vanish. The bears would heal, and perhaps they would hunt again. Yet no story they inspired would carry as much weight as the one born this morning. The tale of the forest's uprising, of giants who answered a desperate cry and shattered the natural order with their fury. The people who stood there knew they would never enter that clearing again without reverence. It was no longer just ground. It was a monument. And in time, when children asked about the scars in the earth, they would be told the same words. That was the day the giants rose. The villagers finally turned from the clearing, though every step away felt heavy, as if they were leaving behind a sacred altar. The forest, once just a place of wood and shadow, now seemed alive with unseen eyes, every rustle a reminder of the guardians that had revealed themselves. As the sun climbed higher, pale gold light spilled over the frost, catching on the gouges and bloodstains that scarred the earth. The scene looked less like the aftermath of a hunt and more like a warning carved into the land itself. The calf and its guardians were gone, swallowed by the endless trees, yet their presence lingered. The people could still hear phantom echoes of hooves pounding like drums, still see the antlers glinting in the mist. Some whispered that the herd had not simply protected their young. They had risen in answer to something greater, a call that bound the forest together against intruders. By the time the last villager disappeared down the trail, the clearing stood empty once more. But it was not forgotten. It never would be. For those who had seen it, the morning's vision would remain etched into memory. The roar of bears, the cries of a calf, and the thunder of giants emerging from the trees. And though the forest was silent again, everyone knew it was watching. The clearing lay still, bathed now in the pale gold of early morning. The bloodstains on the frozen earth glistened like dark jewels, and the broken branches scattered across the ground seemed frozen mid-motion, a reminder of the chaos that had thundered here only moments ago. Yet in the silence, the memory of the giants lingered. Every villager who had witnessed it carried the image burned into their minds. Colossal shapes breaking through the mist, antlers crowned with light, their sheer presence enough to turn predators into prey. Whispers already began among the elders as they walked back toward the village. They spoke of omens, of spirits that lived in the forest, of a power that rose only when balance was threatened. The younger ones, still shaken, followed close, clutching their torches as though the faint flames could keep the memory at bay. But no flame could erase it. Far beyond the clearing, the moose herd pressed deeper into the woods, their steps muffled in the thick carpet of pine needles. The calf walked unsteadily between them, tiny but shielded, its path carved by giants. The air around them was heavy, sacred, as if the forest itself closed in to protect what had been spared. And though no human dared follow, they all knew the truth. This morning had not belonged to man, nor even to beast. It had belonged to the forest. The forest reclaimed its calm, but beneath the stillness lingered an invisible pulse, as though the land itself remembered the clash. Wisps of mist drifted low across the battlefield, curling around gouged soil and splintered wood, veiling the scars but never erasing them. The villagers, now distant along the trail, could not help but glance back again and again. Even with the herd gone, they felt the weight of unseen eyes pressing from the tree line, watching, guarding. Every step away carried the same thought. This ground no longer belonged to men. Deeper within the pines, the bulls slowed their march. The calf wavered on weak legs but pressed on, shielded on every side. One of the great guardians leaned its heavy head toward the youngling, brushing it gently forward, a gesture both commanding and protective. The dawn light filtered through the canopy, catching on the spread of antlers that crowned each bull. For a fleeting moment, it looked less like an animal herd and more like a procession of kings vanishing into their kingdom. And then they were gone, swallowed entirely by the forest's breath, leaving behind only silence. But the silence was no longer empty. It was a vow. Long after the herd had vanished, the forest seemed to hold its breath. The air was thick with the memory of antlers gleaming in the mist and hooves pounding like thunder. Even without their towering forms, the guardian's presence lingered, carved into the very silence. The villagers walked on, but their hearts stayed behind in that clearing. Some whispered prayers under their breath, others kept their eyes fixed on the trail, as though afraid that even looking back might summon the giants once more. Yet all carried the same unspoken thought. They had not simply witnessed animals. They had seen a force older than time itself. Far ahead, the calf stumbled once more, but it did not fall. The lead bull slowed, turning slightly, its massive frame casting a shadow across the youngling. With a deep grunt, it urged the calf forward, and the rest of the herd adjusted, moving as one, unbreakable. The rising sun stretched long beams through the pines, striking the antlers of the bulls as they disappeared deeper into the forest. For a fleeting instant, the light turned them to gold, as though the forest itself had crowned its defenders. And then, in a hush, the herd was gone. But for those who had seen them rise, the story would never fade. When the last echo of hooves faded into the trees, only silence remained. Not the silence of emptiness, but of awe. The clearing stood as a scarred monument to what had unfolded. Torn branches, gouged earth, and the faint trail of a calf that had walked away from certain death. The villagers returned to their homes, but the memory walked with them. That morning would be retold around firesides, whispered to children as both warning and wonder. not of bears and prey, but of the day giants, rose from the forest to defend one of their own. The calf had lived. The predators had fled. And in the eyes of all who witnessed it, the balance of the wild had revealed its truth. For in the heart of the wilderness, strength is not measured only in claws and hunger, but in the guardians willing to rise. And the forest had shown its guardians well. If this story amazed you, don't forget to like and share. More incredible tales from the wild are coming.